Have you ever looked at your blood pressure numbers and thought, hold on, I barely even use salt? Maybe you stopped salting your eggs years ago. Maybe you don't keep the salt shaker on the table anymore. Maybe you even taste your food and think, this doesn't even seem salty. So how is your blood pressure still creeping up? Because after 60, the problem is very often not the salt you can see. It's the salt you never notice. The salt built into foods that don't necessarily taste salty, foods that seem ordinary, foods that are sometimes even marketed as healthy. And once you understand where that sodium is actually hiding, a lot of what happens to blood pressure later in life starts making much more sense. Now, I want to be honest with you right from the start. This is not going to be one of those videos where someone tells you to just cut salt in the most vague, unhelpful way possible and then moves on. I find that kind of advice deeply unsatisfying because the real story is much more specific than that and honestly much more interesting. What I want to do today is show you what changes in the body after 60 that can make sodium matter more than it used to, why blood pressure can react more strongly to it, and then walk you through 7 hidden salt sources that quietly push sodium intake higher without most people realizing it. And one of them, the last one, is not even a food. That's the kind of information that sticks. When you understand the mechanism, you stop seeing blood pressure as some random number your body throws at you. You start seeing cause and effect. You start seeing patterns. And once you can see the pattern, you can't unsee it. So let's build this from the ground up. The first thing I want to tell you is that blood pressure after 60 is not exactly the same conversation it was at 30 or 40. The vascular system changes with age. Arteries gradually become stiffer. The large vessels are not as elastic as they once were. And that matters because healthy arteries don't just carry blood, they also cushion pressure. They expand and absorb force. When they stiffen, more of that pressure stays in the system. That is one reason systolic blood pressure, the top number, so often rises with age. And it's why so many older adults are told they have elevated or high blood pressure even if they feel perfectly fine. The system can be under more pressure long before it feels dramatic. But that is only part of the story. The second part is sodium sensitivity, and this is the piece I really want you to hold on to. As people get older, blood pressure often becomes more sensitive to sodium. Not in every person to exactly the same degree, but enough that it shows up clearly in research and clearly in clinical conversations. In plain English, the same salty diet that a younger body might handle with less visible effect can push blood pressure higher in an older body. Why? Because sodium is a fluid regulator. Sodium attracts water. When sodium intake goes up, the body tends to hold on to more water. More fluid in the bloodstream means more volume moving through blood vessels. More volume means more pressure against vessel walls. That is the simple version, but the deeper version is even more important. As we age, the kidneys often become less efficient at handling sodium loads. The body's ability to get rid of excess sodium as cleanly and quickly as it once did can start to decline. So instead of sodium coming in, being balanced, and moving out smoothly, it can linger longer in the system. And when that happens in a body with stiffer arteries, the pressure effect becomes harder to ignore. Think about it this way. Imagine 2 garden hoses. One is newer, more flexible, able to expand when water rushes through it. The other is older, more rigid, less forgiving. Now increase the water volume in both. Which one ends up under more strain? That is not a perfect analogy, but it gets close enough to understand the point. Aging changes the system, and sodium interacts with that changed system differently. There was a recent trial that made this incredibly concrete. Middle-aged to older adults went through short periods of higher sodium and lower sodium diets, and within just 1 week, blood pressure meaningfully shifted. Not in some abstract statistical way, but in a real, measurable way. The median age was about 61. Many participants saw lower blood pressure on the lower sodium pattern, and the effects showed up regardless of whether they were already taking blood pressure medication or not. That matters because it tells you something very important. Sodium is not some tiny background variable. For a lot of older adults, it is an active lever. Now here is where people get misled. They hear that sodium matters and they imagine the problem is the salt shaker. But in the United States and in many modern diets, most sodium does not come from the salt you sprinkle on food at the table. It comes from packaged foods, prepared foods, restaurant foods, and ingredients that quietly stack on top of one another. That's why someone can say, "I never add salt," and still be getting far more sodium than they realize. And that's the real point of this video. It's not that sodium is hiding in one dramatic villain food. It's that it's distributed across the day in a way that feels harmless. A slice here, a serving there, a bowl, a packet, a dressing, a snack, a convenience choice. Nothing seems extreme on its own, but the body does not experience the day as separate little decisions. The body experiences the total load. So let's get very specific. The first hidden salt source is bread. Bread. Not chips, not fries. Bread. This surprises people every single time, because bread doesn't usually taste salty. It tastes neutral, mild, ordinary. But sodium is often built into bread for flavor, structure, texture, and the baking process itself. And because bread is something people eat repeatedly, toast at breakfast, sandwich at lunch, roll with dinner, it becomes one of those foods where the sodium adds up quietly. This is what makes bread so deceptive. One slice may not look outrageous on a label. That's exactly the problem. It doesn't have to be outrageous. If you eat 2 slices with breakfast, 2 more in a sandwich, maybe crackers later, maybe a wrap or a roll with dinner, suddenly the numbers are stacking before you've even gotten to the obviously salty foods. And after 60, stacking is everything. Blood pressure is not responding to whether a food tastes aggressively salty. It's responding to how much sodium actually entered the bloodstream across the day. Bread is a perfect example of how modern food can feel harmless while still pushing the total load higher. Think about the typical light lunch. Turkey sandwich, maybe mustard, maybe cheese, maybe a pickle on the side. People often think that lunch is modest, but from a sodium standpoint, the bread is already contributing before anything else even gets added. And that brings me to hidden source number 2. Deli meats and processed sandwich meats, turkey slices, ham, roast beef, chicken slices, even the ones marketed with words like lean, oven roasted, or natural. This is one of the classic traps because the food looks protein-rich and practical. It looks like the healthier alternative to fast food. But processed meats are often preserved, seasoned, and stabilized with sodium in ways that can push the numbers up very quickly. And because these foods are thin, tidy, and portioned, they create a false sense of control. 4 slices doesn't feel like much. 6 slices doesn't feel like much. But sodium is concentrated there. So now the viewer who thinks they had a simple sandwich may already have bread sodium, meat sodium, cheese sodium, and condiment sodium all in one meal. This is how blood pressure gets nudged upward without any dramatic salty moment. You don't sit there thinking, I just ate something extreme. You think, I had a normal lunch. That phrase, a normal lunch, is where hidden sodium lives. Now I want to pause here and make an important distinction. This is not about fear. It's not about turning every grocery item into a villain. It's about pattern recognition. A food does not have to be evil to be high in sodium. That's not how biology works. Biology is less emotional than that. Biology is arithmetic. It counts load, timing, and response. And if you want to understand why numbers move after 60, that arithmetic matters. Hidden source number 3 is canned soup and boxed broth. This one is a huge one, especially because soup has a health halo around it. Soup feels comforting, gentle, appropriate. Sometimes it's what people turn to when appetite is low, digestion feels off, the weather is cold, or cooking feels like too much effort. And from a cultural standpoint, soup feels almost medicinal. It feels like the kind of thing that couldn't possibly be a problem. But many canned soups and broths are sodium delivery systems wearing the costume of comfort food. The reason is simple. Sodium does a lot in soup. It intensifies flavor, preserves shelf life, and makes mass-produced soup taste more complete. The trouble is that a serving on paper and a bowl in real life are often not the same thing. A label may look one way for one serving, but if the container holds 2 or more servings and the whole can goes into the pot or the bowl, the math changes fast. And this is one of those places where older adults can get hit by sodium without any sensory warning. Soup doesn't have the crunch or punch of salty snacks. It often tastes warm, savory, balanced. But balanced does not mean low sodium. Broth is similar. People use it to cook rice, flavor vegetables, soften leftovers, or make quick meals feel homemade. But when the base is heavily salted, every healthy ingredient placed into that broth absorbs the same sodium load. So now the person who is trying to eat lighter, something soft, something sensible, may unknowingly be taking in far more sodium than they think. Hidden source number 4 is breakfast food that doesn't even register as salty. Cereal, instant oatmeal packets, biscuits, muffins, pancake mixes, pastries, even some breakfast sandwiches that seem small enough to be harmless. This one matters because people are trained to associate sodium with savory foods, not sweet or bland ones. But sodium is used in baked goods and packaged breakfast foods for texture, processing, leavening, preservation, and shelf stability. So a food can taste sweet, buttery, or neutral and still contain more sodium than you'd expect. And here's why this matters specifically for blood pressure after 60. Morning is when people often set the tone for the whole day without realizing it. If breakfast starts with packaged bread, cereal, frozen breakfast sandwiches, or pastry-type foods, you may begin the day with a sodium load that doesn't feel like a sodium load at all. That matters because hidden sodium is rarely one big event. It's cumulative. It's the breakfast sandwich, then the soup, then the deli lunch, then the sauce at dinner. By the time evening comes, it's not the final meal alone pushing the number. It's the entire day's pattern. And breakfast foods are especially sneaky because they often come with another layer of confusion. People think the concern there is only sugar, but sugar and sodium are not mutually exclusive. A food can be sweet and still be sodium heavy enough to matter. That is why relying on taste is so misleading. Your tongue is not a sodium calculator. A food can be surprisingly salty without presenting itself that way. Hidden source number 5 is condiments, sauces, and dressings. This is the sodium multiplier category. Soy sauce is the obvious one, but it's far from the only one. Bottled salad dressings, barbecue sauce, pasta sauce, ketchup, jarred marinades, seasoning packets, gravy mixes, bouillon, even things like cottage seasoning blends and flavored rice packets. All of these can turn an otherwise moderate meal into a high-sodium meal very quickly. What makes condiments so powerful is not just their sodium content, it's their invisibility inside the meal. People count the chicken, they count the rice, they count the vegetables, they don't count the sauce with the same seriousness, even when the sauce is doing a huge amount of the sodium work. Think about the phrase, "I only used a little." That phrase shows up all the time with condiments. But when a product is highly concentrated, a little can still be a lot. And when you layer condiments, dressing on the salad, sauce on the meat, seasoning in the rice, ketchup on the side, the sodium stacks with almost no resistance from your awareness. This is why restaurant food and takeout can be so tricky too. Even if the plate looks balanced, grilled protein, vegetables, maybe potatoes, sodium can be hiding in the marinade, the seasoning blend, the finishing sauce, the broth base, the dressing, the glaze, and the side condiments all at once. The meal looks clean. The sodium story is not. Hidden source number 6 is cheese, especially the kinds people think of as small, healthy add-ons. Cottage cheese is a perfect example. So are processed cheese slices, shredded cheese blends, and some snack cheeses. Now, I want to be careful here because cheese is not nutritionally one-dimensional. That is not the point. The point is that many people think of cheese as calcium, protein, or convenience, and do not think first about sodium. But depending on the type and portion, sodium can be a significant part of the picture. Cottage cheese is particularly interesting because it has a health reputation. It's high in protein, it's associated with lighter eating. It shows up in good choices lists all the time, and yet many versions are surprisingly high in sodium. So the older adult who feels they are doing everything right, maybe cottage cheese with fruit, maybe crackers and cheese, maybe a quick lunch plate with turkey and cheese, maybe building a very sodium-dense meal out of foods that all individually sound responsible. This is one of the big themes I want you to notice in this video. Hidden sodium often lives in respectable foods, not just junk food. Respectable food. Food that sounds disciplined. Food that sounds practical. Food that sounds medically approved just because it isn't dramatic. That is exactly why it gets missed. And then there is hidden source number 7, which most people never think about until somebody points it out. Fizzy medicines, soluble tablets, effervescent supplements, and some antacids. This is the non-food source I told you we'd come back to. Some medications and over-the-counter products use sodium-containing formulations, especially products designed to dissolve in water quickly. That can include effervescent pain relievers, fizzy vitamin tablets, and certain antacids. And because people do not categorize medicine as part of their sodium intake, it can completely escape attention. But the body does not care whether sodium came from soup or a tablet dropped into water. It still counts. This becomes especially relevant after 60 because that is when medication use often increases. Maybe not for everyone, but broadly speaking, later life tends to involve more prescriptions, more symptom management, more convenience products, more take this as needed items in the cabinet. And when a sodium-containing product becomes a daily or frequent habit, it can quietly add to the total load in a way people never factor into the blood pressure conversation. That does not mean every medication is high in sodium. Not at all. It means the category exists, and it is hidden enough that many people never think to look. And the reason I think this matters is not because it is the biggest sodium source for everybody, but because it perfectly captures the larger point of this entire discussion. Blood pressure after 60 is often being influenced by sources that don't feel like salt. That is the sentence. Not sources that feel wild. Not sources that feel reckless. Sources that feel normal. Let me now tie all of this together, because I think the pattern matters more than any single food on its own. When people imagine high sodium, they tend to imagine obvious things. A bag of chips, fast food fries, pretzels, something aggressively salty. And yes, those foods can absolutely contribute. But the more important modern reality is that sodium is often distributed across ordinary meals in quieter ways. Toast at breakfast, cereal that doesn't taste salty, deli meat at lunch, soup in the afternoon, salad dressing at dinner, a little cheese in between, a fizzy tablet before bed. No single moment feels dramatic, but the bloodstream doesn't experience the day as separate scenes. It experiences the sum of all of it. And in a body with stiffer arteries, with kidneys that may not clear sodium as efficiently as they once did, with blood pressure that is more salt sensitive than it used to be, that sum matters. A lot. This is also why so many people feel confused by their numbers. They are not doing the one thing they thought they were supposed to avoid. They're not salting everything in sight. So the rise in blood pressure feels unfair, random, mysterious. But once you see hidden sodium for what it is, the mystery starts shrinking. There's another part of this that I think is worth saying directly. Not every person responds to sodium in the same way. Some people are more salt sensitive than others. Some will see a stronger blood pressure response than others. Biology has variation built into it. But the broad trend is clear enough that age and sodium remain tightly linked in the blood pressure conversation. And that means I don't use much table salt is often not enough information. A better question is, where is sodium entering the day without being noticed? That question is much more useful, because that's how the real pattern gets exposed. Now, if you wanted a single mental model to carry with you after this video, it would be this. Sodium hides best in foods that feel ordinary, repeated and respectable. Ordinary, because they don't raise alarm. Repeated because you eat them often. Respectable because they sound like sensible choices. Bread, soup, turkey slices, condiments, breakfast foods, cheese, fizzy tablets. That is a very different list from what most people imagine when they hear too much salt. And that difference between imagination and reality is exactly where people get into trouble. There's also a label reading piece to this that I think is genuinely useful, not as a rule to obsess over, but as a lens. On U.S. nutrition labels, around 5% daily value or less is considered low for sodium, and around 20% or more is considered high. That matters because many products don't look shocking until you realize the serving size is tiny, the package contains multiple servings, or several moderate foods are being combined into one meal. That's how you end up with a sandwich that doesn't feel extreme but behaves like one. And that right there is why hidden sodium is such a powerful blood pressure story after 60. It is not just about bad choices, it is about invisible arithmetic. Before I close, I want to make one more point that I think deserves attention. People sometimes talk about blood pressure as if it's only about dramatic long-term health consequences years down the road, and of course that part matters. But there is something more immediate here too. When blood pressure is higher than the system wants it to be, the heart works harder, vessel walls face more force, and the body carries that strain continuously. It's not theatrical, it's quiet. And quiet processes are often the ones people ignore the longest. That is why clinicians keep coming back to sodium, not because it is the only factor in blood pressure, and certainly not because every case is simple, but because it is one of those variables that hides in plain sight while still having real physiological weight. And after 60, plain sight is exactly where the important things often are. Not in exotic foods, not in internet myths, not in miracle hacks, in the breadbasket, in the soup can, in the deli drawer, in the dressing bottle, in the breakfast aisle, in the cottage cheese tub, in the medicine cabinet. That's the real list. So if the title of this video sounded a little dramatic at first, I hope you can now see why doctors keep warning about hidden sodium in later life. It's not alarmism, it's pattern recognition. It's the recognition that blood pressure after 60 is often shaped less by the salt you consciously add and more by the sodium you never noticed was there in the first place. And once you understand that, the entire conversation changes. It stops being, do I use too much salt, and becomes, what is the total sodium pattern of my day? That is a much smarter question, and it is the kind of question that actually reveals something. Because the extraordinary thing about the body is that it is always responding to inputs, even the quiet ones. It responds to what is repeated. It responds to what is hidden. It responds to what feels too ordinary to matter. And in the case of blood pressure after 60, ordinary can matter a lot more than people think. So the next time someone says, I barely eat salty food, remember this: salty taste and sodium load are not the same thing. Hidden salt has never depended on being obvious. In fact, its whole power comes from the opposite. It works best when it feels invisible. And if this video helped you see your food, your labels, or even your medicine cabinet a little differently, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want, leave a comment telling me which of these 7 hidden salt sources surprised you most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.